Trump's mandate or America's gamble. They came in illegally, convicted of murder, of assault, of abuse, and when they were finally on a plane, deported, headed for a distant country, Djibouti. Of all places, a judge in the United States said, "Stop." That single decision by a district court blocked the deportation of 8 illegal immigrants with criminal records. 8 men found guilty of the kind of crimes that make headlines in the worst way. And with that ruling, the story exploded, not because it was rare, but because it captured everything that America is quietly debating behind closed doors. So here's the question. In a nation that claims no one is above the law, who really decides the rules? Judges, voters, or politicians trying to hold their coalition together? Before we dive into the commentary, please like and subscribe to WorldView Today so you won't miss our unique takes on global current affairs. This isn't just about one judge. It's not just about deportations or even about immigration policy. This is about a country on the brink of redefining what leadership means. Donald Trump is returning to the national stage with more than just campaign rallies. He's presenting himself as a commander-in-chief already acting on behalf of a second term. He addresses graduating cadets with the confidence of someone who never left office, and his allies in Congress, like Representative Nancy Mace, are not just echoing support, they are issuing ultimatums. Either help Trump move forward or get out of the way. On the surface, it's a push for immigration control, defense spending, and tax permanence, but beneath the rhetoric lies a far deeper battle about judicial power, fiscal collapse, and the weaponization of legislative precedent. And that, perhaps more than any bill or speech, is what should have us paying attention. Let's take this apart from the top. Judge Brian Murphy, a federal district judge, halted the deportation of individuals who were not just undocumented immigrants, they were convicted criminals. The administration was sending them out, a military aircraft already en route. When the decision came down, critics of the ruling, including Mace, responded with fury. She said, and this was echoed across conservative media, that the judge was not God, that he didn't have the right to override Donald Trump's agenda to protect American citizens. To many Americans, the sentiment is clear. Why should violent criminals be given any process at all? And yet, this is precisely where the American experiment begins to wobble. Due process is not just a legal phrase, it's a constitutional guarantee. And the instant we decide some people don't deserve it, we are no longer a nation of laws, but a nation of exceptions. So the deeper question becomes, can a country both uphold its founding principles and enforce the political will of the majority when those goals no longer align? While that constitutional question lingers, another battle is heating up in Congress. A new bill, hailed by Republicans as a big, beautiful win, proposes increased defense spending and the permanent extension of Trump's tax cuts. The House passed it. The Senate, as always, is where the real negotiations begin. Senator Ron Johnson, known for his sharp fiscal conservatism, raised the red flag. The bill adds to the national debt, pushing the U.S. closer to a $22 trillion addition over the next decade. That's a $2 trillion deficit annually, numbers that would have been unthinkable just a few election cycles ago. His words were not subtle. He called it completely unacceptable, warning that the country needs a return to pre-pandemic spending levels. But this puts the Republican Party at war with itself, because while Johnson raises alarms about the deficit, others, like Mace, defend the bill as a necessary continuation of Trump's economic vision that, they argue, has already been validated by voters. It's here that the real strategic tension lies. Are we solving a debt crisis by growing the economy? Or are we growing the economy while ignoring a debt crisis? Mace argues the latter is justifiable, that increased GDP and tax reform will eventually absorb the debt concerns, but even that logic rests on assumptions that have, historically, been shaky at best. Let's be clear. The bill doesn't just touch economics, it links directly to national security. Part of the funding is set aside for enhanced border control. And here, again, the message is unmistakable. America's southern border is not just a policy issue, it's being reframed as a matter of life and death, of sovereignty, and of security. The idea that foreign nations are opening up their prisons and letting criminals walk into the U.S. is an image tailor-made for political campaign sand. It's one that Trump and his allies know how to wield effectively. But what gets lost in the noise is a more dangerous precedent. The idea that any judge or legal system standing in the way of executive enforcement is now painted not just as misguided, but as illegitimate, because when judges become enemies of policy, not interpreters of law, we don't just undermine judicial independence, we rewrite the balance of powers with rhetoric instead of legislation. Trump's critics say this is dangerous. His supporters say it's necessary, but whichever side you're on, the facts are unavoidable. What used to be a constitutional check is now treated like a political obstacle. And the rhetoric doesn't stop there. Mace went further, accusing countries of deliberately emptying prisons and flooding America with violent criminals. Her words, they need to be deported immediately. No room for nuance. No time for courts. No patience for legal process. Because in this worldview, hésitation equal danger, compassion is weakness. And America, as a sovereign nation, must put itself first, even if it means throwing due process out the window when the accused cross an invisible border. But here's the twist. This hardline position on law and order exists side by side with an open challenge to the very notion of political due process, because in the same breath, Representative Mace is now calling for the expulsion of Democratic Congresswoman LaMonica McIver, who faces criminal charges before trial, before verdict, before anything has been proven beyond headlines. The justification: Democrats did it first. When Republicans expelled George Santos, it was controversial, but it followed an indictment. Now Mace says the bar has been lowered, and if McIver is charged, that's enough to remove her from office. No waiting, no trial, no presumption of innocence. Democrats set the precedent, she claims. Let's start with McIver. It's a stunning contradiction, because on one hand, her defense of Trump's immigration agenda rests on the principle that lawbreakers don't deserve the protection of process. On the other hand, she weaponizes that same logic inside Congress, accusing political opponents and calling for removal before the courts have spoken. The argument is no longer legal. It's cultural, tribal, and dangerously absolute. This is the deeper interest at play. What's happening in Washington is not about bills. It's not even about Trump. It's about rewriting how American institutions work, who gets to be heard, who is silenced, and when process becomes optional. And this is precisely where democracy begins to split at the seams, because once political power is used to preempt legal proceedings, the courtroom becomes irrelevant, and political allegiance replaces presumption of innocence. So what happens when both parties adopt this posture? When each side sees the other not just as wrong, but as illegitimate, it's already happening. Republicans say Biden's policies are a threat to national security. Democrats say Trump is undermining democracy. Both are using institutional levers to silence, censor, investigate, and expel. The debate is no longer about policy. It's about survival. And the bill that promises economic growth and border protection, it's just the surface tension over a much deeper fracture. Nowhere is this more evident than in the conversation about the national debt, Senator Ron Johnson warns that the current trajectory will add $22 trillion to America's already bloated deficit. That's not a political opinion. It's arithmetic. The U.S. is borrowing money at record levels to fund a future that neither side fully controls. And both parties, Republican and Democratic, used reconciliation bills to push through controversial agendas without bipartisan support. So when Mace says, Democrats set the precedent, now we'll use it too. It's not just about policy anymore. It's about using every tool, every loophole, every opening, because the other side will do the same. Compromise is no longer the goal. Domination is, which brings us to the global implications. When the U.S. shifts its governance from deliberative consensus to brute force legislation, the world pays attention. Allies in Europe begin to question America's long-term stability. Investment decisions shift. Trade relations get complicated. And adversaries, especially in Beijing and Moscow, see opportunity. Because in their eyes, an America that is divided internally cannot lead externally. China, facing its own economic slowdown and geopolitical scrutiny, benefits from a distracted United States. Every dollar America spends on internal conflict and debt, on border crisis, on political showdowns is a dollar not spent on global strategy. Russia sees the same window in Ukraine. When domestic dysfunction dominates headlines, international deterrence weakens. And those who understand that will act accordingly. And so, the bill becomes more than a domestic fight. It becomes a message to the world. It says, America's leadership is conditional, now contingent on elections, on judges, on which party controls which chamber, what was once assumed to be stable bipartisan defense, economic continuity, rule of laws, now all up for renegotiation. The consequences? When political legitimacy becomes fluid, so too does international trust. When judicial orders can be overruled by public outrage, foreign governments learn not to rely on legal continuity. When lawmakers threaten to remove each other based on charges alone, authoritarian leaders abroad find irony too delicious to ignore. And when massive spending bills pass with warnings from economists, the dollar still, the world's reserve currency, faces new scrutiny. Because, let's not be naive, the world may not always admire American leadership, but it has always depended on its predictability. Now that predictability is eroding subtly, structurally, and steadily. And at the heart of this erosion is a quiet revolution, one that replaces norms with narratives, institutions with individuals, and patience with power grabs. You can hear it in every soundbite. They didn't want due process on their way in, so they don't get it on their way out. It sounds definitive, righteous. But what if that same logic is turned inward? What if one day the government decides that you don't deserve due process either because of who you voted for, what you posted online, or which protest you attended? That's not a border crisis anymore. That's a constitutional one. And while Washington debates how many reconciliation bills it can squeeze through before the next election, the rest of the world is recalibrating its expectations. Europe, still trying to chart an independent security path post-Brexit and post-Afghanistan, sees a U.S. torn between governing and campaigning. Nations like Germany and France are pushing defense conversations that once would have been unthinkable without direct American support. Why? Because they can no longer be sure the U.S. will remain consistent. Meanwhile, in Asia, China's leadership is learning something else. That American dysfunction is more valuable than any diplomatic breakthrough. Beijing doesn't need to win global hearts, and mindset just needs Washington to keep fighting itself. And so far, it's working. Because in the time America has spent debating whether convicted felons deserve deportation or tax cuts deserve permanence, China has expanded its presence in Africa, signed new energy deals in the Middle East, and deepened its currency agreements with Brazil and Russia. It's filling the gaps America used to occupy. And those gaps aren't just economic, they're ideological. There was a time when democracy itself was the product. America exported it, promoted it, defended it. But now, democracy looks fractured, like something fragile, something partisan, something expendable when it gets in the way. And every time an American lawmaker says we don't need process, we need action, autocrats around the world breathe easier. Because that's exactly the logic they've used for decades. Even allies like Japan, South Korea, and Australia have begun investing in independent security structures, just in case the next Congress turns inward again. No one is saying it out loud. But the implication is clear. Trust in American constancy is fading, not because of policy, but because of chaos. And here's the paradox. The same leaders who call for border walls and mass deportations under the banner of law and order are often the ones most willing to discard legal norms when it suits them. And the voters who cheer for decisive executive action today may be the ones shocked by unchecked executive power tomorrow. Because erosion doesn't start with a bang. It starts with a shrug, with a compromise here, a shortcut there. And then one day, the structure that held everything together doesn't hold anymore. You can hear it in the rhetoric around defense spending too. Nancy May says she supports expanding the military budget. That's not controversial. What is controversial is her simultaneous call to cut multi-billion-dollar contracts where, in her words, hundreds of people aren't doing any work. It's a compelling soundbite, but it raises another question. If waste in military contracts is obvious, why has it persisted for decades across administrations? The answer lies in a fundamental contradiction. America spends more than any nation on earth to maintain its military dominance, but much of that spending is structured to protect jobs, not necessarily to win wars. It's about local economies, lobbying networks, and political inertia. And while Congress argues over which party supports the troops more, the real defense dilemma remains unaddressed. Efficiency versus influence. So when a lawmaker says, we need to be more efficient with our dollars, the follow-up should be, which programs are you willing to cut? Which contracts are you willing to cancel? Which districts are you willing to defund? And that's where the rhetoric usually stops. Because politics, at the end of the day, isn't about consistent logic. It's about survival. Which brings us to the final, unspoken truth behind all of this. Many of these arguments about borders, spending, immigration, due process, and congressional expulsions aren't really about solving problems. They're about keeping base voters angry, engaged. Mobley said, "The outrage is the point. Every deportation battle, every judicial clash, every ethics accusation turned campaign ad, they are all part of a larger strategy to keep the American public in a state of permanent division. Because when you're always on defense, you stop asking deeper questions. You stop questioning your own side. You stop expecting anything better than noise. And that's where democracy dies, a little not with violence, but with volume. When every issue is life or death, when every opponent is an existential threat, when every disagreement becomes a war, cry what space is left for governance? None. And that suits some politicians just fine. Because a country permanently at war with itself is easier to control than one that insists on thinking for itself. If you value this perspective, consider subscribing to WorldView Today and sharing it with someone who still believes in critical thinking.